Okay, it looks like we're taping. Let's come to order. Today is the Wednesday, August 20th, regular meeting of the Glendale Planning Commission. Could I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Sheets.
Here.
Commissioner Torgerson.
Here.
Commissioner Gerald.
Here.
Commissioner Lee.
Here.
And Chair Kane.
Here. Report regarding posting of agenda, please.
The agenda for this meeting was posted on Wednesday, August 13th, 2008, on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
All right. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Next agenda item is the introduction of our newest member, Mr. Cheng Lee. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
Any introductory remarks?
Well, I'm a sponge is my nickname, so I'll be all sponge. Try to absorb as much as I can, so that I can become a productive member here. And I'll be looking forward to working with you all, and hope that you guide me in the right direction, so that I can be I can serve the community well.
Very good. Well, welcome. If this was a morning session, we'd say that the new members have to bring donuts, but since it's afternoon, we won't. Great, and welcome again. I'm going to move on to approval of minutes. We have minutes from August 6th. Any comments or corrections? Seeing none, could we have a motion, please?
I move that we approve the minutes. I'll second.
Motion and support, please call roll.
Commissioner Sheets.
Aye.
Commissioner Torgerson.
Aye.
Commissioner Gerald.
Aye.
Commissioner Lee.
Abstain.
And Chair Kane.
Aye. On a vote of 4-0 with one abstention, the minutes of August 6th were approved. Under oral communications, I have one card, which I believe is directly related to Mr. Lee joining us. That's from Gary Cornell.
Mr. Lee, if you could come over here to the podium. Being retired, Freudian slip here. That's why you're on planning and I'm retired. But Freudian slip that I had to present this to you at our meeting, but I wanted to take this liberty at this time. On behalf of your skills, leadership skills as chairman of CDBG 207-208, to present this plaque to you on behalf of your former colleagues.
Oh.
It's with my pleasure that I present this to you.
Thank you very much.
Camera can see it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kane.
Our pleasure. All right, we'll move on to agenda item 9A. It's the general plan amendment, PGP 2008 through 2001. It's the revision to the housing element. Staff's recommended by Laura Stotler, the principal planner, and the recommendation is to discuss changes to the draft housing element and recommend approval of the negative declaration and approval of the draft housing element to council.
Chairman Kane, members of the commission, you received a draft copy of the housing element. It looks like this. If there's members of the public who are out there, you can get a copy on the city's website.
Is the entire housing element on the website?
The entire housing element is on the website with all attachments. And I know it's quite a large document. I know we gave you a couple of weeks to read it. We also gave you a list of responses that we had received, or actually we'd received a comment letter from HCD, that's Housing Community Development Department at the state. They're charged with reviewing housing elements. And they gave us a comment letter on our preliminary draft. And we responded to the preliminary draft. In this draft, we gave you a copy of basically a cheat sheet that we were sending to HCD. It says where to find the changes, because I know you've had a chance to review the preliminary draft. The intent was that this might help you focus in on where we actually made the changes to the housing element. A majority of these comments dealt with what I think of as the factual basis for the housing element. And then there were some program changes that we also included Those we also highlighted in the staff report for you. So with the two documents, the highlighted changes that we made in response to HCD comments, as well as the staff report that focuses in on what our programmatic changes are for the next 8 years, that really is really the heart of what the changes are in this draft from the previous housing element. And so I'd like to focus in on our presentation. I know our presentation focuses in on what our programs are that we're looking at changing, but I know that since we have two new planning commission members, you didn't see the original presentation, so I'm going to review a little bit of that. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that we're going to go a little bit of review for the commissioners who've already seen it. Our housing element, it's a state requirement, and right now we're working on an update of the 2006 to 2014 housing element. So it's an 8-year document. The housing element is part of the city's general plan. There's actually 7 required elements of the general plan. Housing is one. And as part of this plan, we're required to show that we can meet the existing and projected housing needs for all economic segments of Glendale. It also establishes the goals and policies that we have to meet our housing needs. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment is prepared by the Southern California Association of Governments, and it's based on various demographic data, namely population and housing and employment data. Based on those numbers that come from HCD, actually from RENA, they give us a number of housing units that we have to show that we can provide during the planning period. And those housing units are broken down by income categories, and they're also, for us, broken down to a target for zoning. So we have to show that we have zoning to allow that capacity. Not that we're actually going to build them ourselves, but that the capability is there so someone could build them. So these are our actual RENA numbers from SCAG. We have 767 very low-income units. That category is actually divided into two. There's an extremely low-income category, which has been identified by the state. And so the extremely low income is half of the very low-income category. We also have low-income, moderate income, above moderate. So in total, we're looking at approximately 3,100 units that we need to show capacity for, and that's zoning capacity. We formed a housing task force back in December, and the purpose of that housing task force was to look at the existing element that we had, review it, evaluate the goals and policies, see where we could have improvements. They provided input on the various housing needs that affect all constituencies in the city. They looked at our policies, they looked at our programs, they looked at our strategies. We had meetings with the housing task force in December, January, March, May, and then most recently 2 weeks ago in August. And the most recent meeting, they looked at the actual document that you received. And some of the comments that came out after that document were included in an attachment in your staff report. We have a new section 4.5. There was some data that we had not received from a consultant. We wanted to make sure we had the right data. So that chapter was actually included in your staff report. But I would like to point out that it was not actually in the printed copy here. And when we had the draft document that you actually saw it back in February, we sent it to HCD for comments. The comments were received in May. We received comments from our housing task force in May. We received comments from Public Counsel, again, a public interest law firm. We received comments from Shelter Partnerships. They focus in on homeless housing and housing for low income. We also had comments from the State Housing and Community Development Department. Those were extensive comments. And we also had a response to those comments in the form of changes that are in this draft. So just to summarize the key findings, again, these are in your staff report. You can also find the major accomplishments on page 7 in the housing element itself. But again, we reviewed the past actions that we had taken over the last 5 years, the previous housing element. That was actually a housing element that was adopted in 2000. It was a 2000 housing element. We also looked at the housing programs we had done, the number of housing units we had created. We looked at, evaluated how effective were we in meeting our housing goals, our previous housing goals. And at that time, we had a 7-year housing plan. And we also included a summary of key findings for this element itself. These are the new housing goals that we're looking at doing. We responded to comments that came from HCD and the other public interest groups, the Housing Task Force, Those are some of our key findings can be found on page 9. And we have those under the 6 goals, and the 6 goals were really goals that are included for housing in our 8-year housing program in the future. So how are we going to address those goals? What comments came in? How do we think we're going to meet those? And then the 8-year plan itself, it's a 2006 to 2014 plan. Again, I'd like to focus in on some of the housing strategies and housing programs that we've actually identified. You can think of that as really, the 8-year plan is really being the work program of what are we going to do to meet our housing needs. We also received comments on housing policy. And I've kind of differentiated between housing programs and housing policy, because a housing policy comment came in on second units. And this is a comment that was received from Public Counsel as well as the State Housing Community Development Department. The city has a policy, we adopted it over 10 years ago, in which we did not adopt one of the statewide policies that says we have to have an allowance for second units on all single-family zoned properties. We have not adopted that. General law cities, my understanding is they're required to have that. We are a charter city. We are not required to have that. And we adopted findings. So while the comments came in from other agencies that said we had to look at this, we addressed it in the housing element by saying we have looked at this in the past, and at this time we're not proposing a change to that policy. So we're proposing to leave a second unit policy prohibitions in place. Another comment that we received was related to inclusionary housing. This is a comment that was received from Public Counsel. Their suggestion was that we allow inclusionary housing citywide. And what an inclusionary housing policy is, it's a requirement that when new units are built, that a certain percentage of those be affordable. And it could be affordable to a certain segment of the community. Right now, there's a requirement under redevelopment law that says in new redevelopment project areas, there is an inclusionary requirement the city has to have. And we do have a limited inclusionary housing requirement to that area. In our case, it's San Fernando Road project area. That does have an inclusionary requirement. They could either build the units in the area, build affordable units outside the area, or they could pay an in lieu fee. That option still exists. And at this time, because council has looked at that relatively recently, we are not proposing a change, as was suggested by Public Counsel and the Housing Task Force, that we look at it citywide. At this time, we are proposing no change at all. It would just remain inclusionary units in San Fernando Road redevelopment project area. For program strategies, again, these are part of the 8-year plan. We have 8-year plan strategies, and then underneath these strategies, we have programs to implement them. So one of them is preservation and enhancement of existing housing stock, production of affordable housing, rental assistance, increased ownership opportunities, housing services, fair housing, and then we have a new one that we've added, sustainability. We've added sustainability in response not only to comments that we've received from the Housing Task Force, but also to comments we've received from the general public and from the council. The whole focus of the city looking at having a green team and going green. We feel this is the right time to put the sustainable housing policies in our document as well. So I'd like to focus in on some of the program strategies. We have neighborhood target areas. This is program 1E. One of the comments we received from Housing Community Development was that we've identified 2 housing target areas that we have right now. We have Adams Square, and then we also have East Garfield neighborhood. Those are in the works. I believe Adams Square is nearing completion, if it's not already complete. And we identified in our document that we are intending to have another neighborhood target area. Because that follows our past pattern. However, we do not have a funding source identified for that. We do not know which target area we would identify. We don't have, without a funding source, we don't have a timing identified. So one of the comments from HCD is that we identify a funding source, a location, and time. And so in our document, we have not identified that. However, we've given an explanation of why, although our clear intent, our clear past pattern has been when one project completes, we start looking at the potential for doing a new one. And we feel that will be the same pattern, but we don't feel we need to put that in the housing element at this time. We also have neighborhood family design or multifamily design guidelines that we're looking at. That would be program 1G. These are in the works right now. And so we're basically memorializing a program that we are doing. Direct city financial assistance, 2B. This actually came out of a comment that we received this week from Public Counsel. Their comment was that we need to have a program, or actually add some more specificity to the program to actually say what target areas we would be, or target properties we would be looking at acquiring for a land acquisition, and also identify funding sources for that. Again, we do not have funding identified at all for any additional programs at this time. And so while we looked at their comment and we've considered it, we have not recommended any changes to the program that we already have in our document. And also one of the comments that they said is that we should show a way that we encourage people to combine parcels, since most of our parcels are smaller. And we feel we already have such a program. We have a lot consolidation policy that if you have lots over 90 feet, or a development that has over 90 feet of frontage, that you have additional density. We feel that meets that requirement. We also have a condominium conversion of over-density buildings program 4D. In October, the council is going to be reevaluating their condo conversion policy. Presently, if you have an apartment building that was built under old code, it might be over-density for what is allowed today. And one of the requirements we have in our code is that new subdivisions have to be consistent with the general plan. So we have a case where we have quite a supply of older multifamily units that are above the general plan density, and this program would recognize that the council might want to reevaluate that and might want to allow conversions of properties that are over the current density to be condominium units rather than apartments. We also have a reasonable accommodation procedure that we've added. This is Program 5C. We responded to a comment that came from Shelter Partnerships and added this. Again, it's a requirement that we have a reasonable accommodation procedure, and that's a state law requirement. Other state law requirements include programs 5D, 5E, and 5F. That's for water and sewer service priority, zoning for compliance with California Welfare Institutions codes, and also zoning for compliance with SB2. We are also looking at having consistent definitions for residential and institutional uses related to housing, Program 5G, and that's very similar to constraints on housing for persons with disabilities, 6B. They both came out of the same comment, although a slightly different focus. It came out of, in the past, we actually tried to comply with state law, and we broadened our definitions for residential congregate care. And at this point, that broad definition might actually do conflicts with other housing definitions, so we want to just clarify what those definitions are. We also have two new programs that would be under Sustainability Program Strategy, compliance with AB 32, and review of housing standards for multimodal transportation options. A negative declaration was prepared for this project, and a final negative declaration is included in your packet along with the initial study and all the responses to the environmental document. And our recommendation is that the Commission recommend approval of the environmental document and also approval of the updated housing element to City Council. That concludes staff's presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Any questions from the Commission at this moment?
Not at this moment.
How do you have a suggestion, Laura, on how you might want to proceed from your initial comment in terms of us making comments, observations, that type of stuff? In other words, is there a process that you'd like us to go through or you think might be beneficial, or is it just carte blanche?
Well, it's really carte blanche, but it may be easier to take a look at the policy first and then move on to the programs if you have any concerns with them.
Well, I guess, and you kind of hit on it during your presentation. I'm curious, just to kind of reiterate, state law, there's certain things that we need to do, and they're pretty much non-negotiable. You mentioned one that we can ignore because we're a charter city as opposed to general law, which is the second units. So I guess I look at that as we have state law requirements, then we have, for lack of a better phrase, what's good for Glendale. You know, where do we want our city to be for the next 8 years as it relates to housing, and what kind of foundation do we want to lay beyond that? Now, the two that come to my mind in terms of talking was the second unit conversation and the condo conversion. Those are two things that are kind of good for Glendale type things. What other ones, because for my own purposes, if the state law is requiring us to bring ourselves into compatibility, I don't see much to talk about. Unless there's a tactic or a strategy, and I'd like planning maybe if they want to address that. If there's something in there that you think would be beneficial to really emphasize in terms of the state requirements, bring it up. But otherwise, I think I'd like to focus more on the, good for Glendale.
Well, I would just say I think our housing element is in compliance, as we've addressed the comments that came from HCD. Many of the comments that were included in that May 13th letter from State Housing Community Development were related to shoulds. Those are state goals. They may not necessarily be our goals. And we're very fortunate that we do have a very active housing department in Glendale. Our community development and housing staff are very proactive, and they it's around the clock, 24 hours a day operation almost. They're definitely an active group, and they're constantly, every year, reevaluating their housing programs. We have a housing authority that meets every week. So there's plenty of opportunity all year long for input on housing. And I think with the housing law at the state, when it's really designed, it was designed for those jurisdictions that may not have active housing authorities and housing programs. Because the requirement under state law is that you update the housing element once every 5 years. Although with their funding cycle, it's actually in this case like once every 7 or 8 years. And I think a lot of the programs and the mandates that come down from the state don't assume that we have ongoing housing programs. And so I think in terms of Glendale, our programs may not exactly fit into what the state had envisioned as a housing element, simply because we are more active than most agencies. And we update our policies and have ongoing communications with the public. I mean, as Mr. Lee can attest, we have public meetings related to housing and a lot of public forums relating to housing all year long, and with a variety of funding sources. And there's a variety of opportunity for public comment. So some of the comments that were from HCD, I think we've addressed them, and I think, in fact, we exceed them, and I don't feel that there's anything in the state's letter to us that we have not adequately addressed in this document. If it comes down to a policy level of how do we want to treat second units or how do we treat condominium conversions, I think we've addressed the state needs, and I think at this point, it's fine to focus in exactly on what we think Glendale needs, because I think overall we have shown that we can meet our regional housing need, which is the main goal of the state. We show in our programs that we are complying with a variety of other state laws, whether it's related directly to housing or service provisions. We've provided that, and I think we've provided the analysis to back up that data. So if you feel comfortable moving on to just a policy discussion that we could forward to council, I think that would be appropriate. I don't know if Hassan would have additional information to add.
Yeah, to say, I guess, what Laura was saying in response to your question, Mr. Chair, I think the parameters that you're trying to identify between what the state requirements are and what's good for Glendale, and if there is a gap in between the two, to what extent we are able to address those. I think that's part of what you're asking. And that's exactly the purpose of this exercise. At some level, we think we know up to a point, because what happens every 5 to 10 years that the housing elements across the state are being updated, that this dialogue takes place, that we all look at the strict requirements of the state, and then we are in dialogue with various interest groups that are trying to always to push the housing element requirements across the state up to in different directions, and some mostly advocacy groups that want to demand more from local agencies in terms of the requirements. So the dialogue falls in this gray area that we think we have addressed the state requirements, and some people will keep arguing with us that, no, you could address it more. They may not say, no, you haven't addressed it, but they'll say you could address some of these more. And I think what staff have identified, Laura and the rest of the staff who've been working on this, I think they have found a safe place that they think we have adequately responded to those, but we don't necessarily know until after we get your final comments and we make the changes and we send them to the state and we get their next set of comments.
In terms of springing into the policy aspect of things, I'd like to, and maybe there's 3 or 4 or 5 things, maybe there's not much. I'd like to know, since this is kind of a path that we're on, and every few years the element changes and the path changes a little bit. Maybe, and whether it's you, Laura, or you, Hassan, maybe you could kind of just give us a couple of minutes in terms of what you see has been the evolution of the housing element from, let's say, the one from, I guess it was 7 years ago. And for example, I know one thing, the state is basically looking at us and saying, you don't need to have as many housing units available in this plan that you did 7 years ago. And is that because of California changing, or is that simply recognition that we're building out more?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think it's a recognition that perhaps the RENA numbers that were given to us in 2000 were unrealistic because of the formula that they used. Glendale does have a large land area. However, when you look at how much open space and hillside area we have, it may not be suitable for development. And so I think Jeff Hamilton had a lot to do with the fact that Glendale's numbers in 2000 were over 7,000 regional housing need units, and now we're at half that. We're at 3,100, and a large part of that had to do with Jeff Hamilton actively working with the SCAG, because he pointed out the fact that there's a lot of topographic constraints, there's ownership constraints, there's existing development and infrastructure that wasn't perhaps taken into account when SCAG did their projections 10 years ago. Whereas now, that's part of the reason why it's gone down. Also, I think there's been a recognition that perhaps growth in Glendale isn't to the extent that it was before. And that
If I may add a couple more. The reason that Jeff participated way before the arena numbers were even published was that he wanted to take a proactive role in this case so that we have some rhyme or reason behind the arena numbers before they come out, so that we're not in a position where we have to defend why we think the arena numbers are exaggerated at the time that we're preparing the housing element. In this case, not only were they exaggerated, but they were actually in the past looking at the past patterns of development, and then the cities that had large amounts of development and large population growth were somehow expected to continue the same patterns, as it is usually with demographic analysis and projections. In this case, Glendale had grown in the 80s and the early 90s quite substantially, and then the same pattern was being assumed. And then some other cities that had slower growth perhaps were not being asked to grow in order to take their really fair share of the numbers that would be projected for the future. So Jeff managed to participate in that dialogue and make that discussion a part of the rationale that was being taken into account. Not only did our city benefit from it, many other cities that were pretty much maxed out at the point that the arena numbers were published actually benefited from Jeff's participation in developing the numbers.
Okay, Jeff.
So now, thank you for explaining or going into that a little bit. So now, what are you seeing in terms, besides just the raw data? 3,000 units instead of, I think, roughly 7,000, you said. What other things have you seen the state kind of tacking, and what are you seeing that Glendale should be doing in terms of, changing the direction from 7 years ago? I mean, just in a narrative kind of conversation.
I will say a couple of broad issues, and then Laura can probably expand on them in greater detail. But we see 2 or 3 different patterns. One is that the several housing advocacy organizations and interest groups are really pushing the state towards adopting mechanisms to track and see, in fact, after we develop the housing elements and we establish the policies, and if in fact we are showing results, in other words, we're showing that the production of housing is consistent with the policies that we said would generate or provide opportunities to generate additional housing. And that particular conversation is actually at a pivotal point right now, because for the state to adopt a stick, so to speak, to say if you do not, you will be somehow, you will have to respond in a different way, as opposed to no, all we are asking is for you to provide sufficient reasonable opportunities, which has been the direction that they were going. That is where we think we find ourselves in a lot of dialogue with HCD and the housing advocacy groups, because they do want to push further in terms of the level of requirements we impose in our housing element.
And I would also like to say, just to build on that, a lot of the comments that we've, or new laws that we've seen proposed at the state level have to do with by right development. So it seems like there's a real push on the part of some housing advocates to make it very difficult to turn down new housing. And there have been a lot of concerns, at least the comments from HCD and from housing advocates regarding housing constraints. So for instance, in Glendale, where we have design review, we have laws that we have FAR limits, we have strict parking requirements, because we know that makes life livable in Glendale. There's been a lot of push to say that we really need to analyze those and say, what does that really mean? Can somebody really build to what the maximum is under the zone? Can they really get those units that you say the zoning allows? And is it still affordable development if you have people go through procedures like CUPs or whatever a city might have? In Glendale, it could be CUPs, it could be variance process, it could be design review. So there's a lot of discussion in our document of that housing constraint. So you'll see that in Chapter 6. It's quite an extensive discussion of the various ones we have. And I really think that this whole, if you look at the evolution of housing law, I think you'll see this tightening of restrictions and have less and less autonomy at the local jurisdictional level for deciding what type of housing units and where housing units should be located.
So you're basically starting to say that you're getting the sense that maybe from a state level, we're going to start losing local control in terms of density issues, FARs, the number of units per acre, that type of stuff?
I would say housing advocates are definitely pushing that direction. And it may not be just affordable housing. It may be things like housing services. And I mean, I think it's a broader category than just merely just the housing units. I mean, there's a lot of discussions of what do you do with special needs housing? What do you do with housing for the elderly? And how do you treat people with disabilities? And how do you allow people to stay in their homes? The whole issue of having a reasonable accommodation procedure came out of state laws related to if somebody has their existing house and they want to stay there, can they stay there with existing code? So, I mean, it's a very broad policy base when you talk about housing, but I think if you're going to generalize it to which direction the state is going, I think it is going toward less local NIMBYism, if I was going to use the term, of having more and more by right zoning, where there's less and less input perhaps from neighbors, and more of a, if you have the zoning, then a developer can build it, and more burden on the city if we decide to deny something that otherwise would be in the code. I think that's where I see this as being where the state's going, because they have an affordable housing crisis and they're looking for a way to meet it, and they realize that there's not enough funding available to build their way out of it on their own. So how do you address it? Well, you have higher densities, you have housing elements that analyze that, and you basically encourage local developments to provide higher density zoning, so developments could be built by a private developer within cities by right. I don't know if Mr. Garcia may have other comments on that too.
Just to speak to your question, Mr. Chair, about the trends, and it does go in line with the push to have more by right densities. For example, those cities that cannot meet the arena number under their current program have to show that they're going to rezone their property within their jurisdictions within a certain time frame, and it has to be at a by right density. So you see the state in that part of the legislation that deals with those cities that can't meet the arena numbers have to rezone their properties within a certain amount of time to provide by right development the design review process, that any city that's subject to those requirements has to be very truncated. There was also, just to speak to this issue, the trend, that there was a push for legislation a couple years ago which was going to require, and it didn't pass, but there was a significant push for it by both the housing advocates and the builders communities to have what were called housing opportunity plans, where cities were going to have to come up with 10-year plans to allow for a certain amount of housing based on the RENA numbers, and was going to have to basically approve all the housing at once and allow for a streamlined environmental review process for any project that came within those housing opportunity plans. Now, again, that didn't pass, but there was a significant push for it, and I think you can expect that that type of legislation is going to come back before the state legislature over the next few years, probably once the economy recovers.
But we're not reacting to that now in this housing plan, are we?
No, we're not.
In the overall scheme of things, we are a mature, developed city, and keep in mind that the way that the housing advocacy activities in Sacramento really have been combining cities like us with those edge cities that are dealing with raw land development. And that is why the two advocacy groups that were not in the past traditionally on the same path have come together, which is the developers and the housing advocacy groups, that in one way or another they wanted to remove a lot of the local opposition to growth and development, especially in the areas where raw land was being subdivided very quickly over the last decade. Now, with the change in the housing market, it's anybody's guess how that's going to be, or if the pressure from the advocacy groups to remove local control will be as strong as it has been over the past few years.
That's kind of sounds like a match made in hell. Because one of my questions is, okay, you've got these advocacy groups, activist groups, whatever phrase you want to attach to them, that are pushing in a direction that if things really get glum in the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have a lot less autonomy in our city. We're going to have these by right density issues popping up, perhaps, that type of thing. What's the counterweight to that? I mean, what organizations? Is it at a city level, like where Glendale pushes back, or is there a mantle of someone else? Normally, it's the developers, but they're motivated by density. You've got advocate groups that want plenty of room for plenty of people. That joining of groups, the only way that splinters is at the point where they start talking about affordable housing. Everybody gets their density, and then they can just have a little knife fight between them as to, what goes into that density. So, getting back to the question, is there anybody that's counterweighting this argument?
Local jurisdictions, and then the League of the Cities, and because there are so many, and I think Mr. Garcia was pointing out to some legislation that did not pass. One of the reasons, I think Mr. Garcia can confirm or add to this, one of the reasons that legislation does not that kind of legislation does not pass very quickly is that local jurisdictions are very active with Sacramento to explain why local control and in terms of our growth and our development procedures is so important, and that message is getting across. To what extent is always something we keep our eyes on.
Well, so in that regard, and we've pointed it out, what a great job Jeff Hamilton did in reducing that threshold. I mean, that's kind of the actions you're talking about there. So, if we've already said it, we'll say it again, attaboy Jeff. But, next time we want to have 3 or 4, attaboys to be able to spread around. What else?
Well, the only other thing I would point out is that we do have Appendix A, which we've included in the document, and what that is our adequate sites analysis. And I guess that would perhaps be the biggest example of where you can see the state's shift in, I guess, Big Brother coming down and saying, where do you actually have these sites? If you say you have the zoning capacity, where are they? What's on them? How do you prove that you can actually meet the densities that you say you can provide? And so I would point out that what the analysis that we did includes a general plan designation that shows the actual address, the parcel number, the existing number of units, the possible number of units, the land area, and what the existing use is on the site right now. And we've done that for all the multifamily zones in the city. And there's an explanation of the rationale of how we came up with the number of units. And based on this, this is our adequate sites analysis. And we actually have maps that show where they are. In fact, there's one that's up for multifamily that's on the wall behind you. It's just a blow-up of the copy that's actually in the document. And right now, there's not a requirement that says just because a unit is listed in this and a potential is listed in this document that you have to be able to build it there. But that was a proposal several years ago. So again, this is it's coming. It's definitely a strong trend that if you have a housing element and if you have zoning and it says that a certain percentage of units or a number of units could be built on the site, it's very likely that in the future we'll see other attempts by the state to say that it's going to be hard to turn that sort of housing down in the future. So I guess that's, if you want, the biggest example of where there's been a shift is this example. I mean, this is added another 40 pages to our document, and it's directly in relation or in response to a state law for that. So is it likely to continue? I would say definitely the state is likely to continue doing this just because housing advocates are pushing for it, and there is a need for affordable housing in California.
Mr. Sheets?
You've said a lot that being new here and just getting acquainted with the housing element doesn't surprise me, but it concerns me what we're discussing right now from the standpoint that where are we in the continuum? Did this just occur over the past 7 years? Has it evolved and it started gradually 2 years ago and now it's reaching a pinnacle, or is it going to reach the high point 5 or 10 years from now? My sense in what you're saying is that sooner more than later. And my fear in that is we have a choice. Do we sit here and let the state, and maybe this is the only choice we might have in the long run, but do we sit and let the state dictate what needs to be done and kind of us go lockstep like every other city would, and like we have a responsibility to be involved and carry our weight, but each city's different. You mentioned in the 80s and whatever, 70s, 80s, mid to late 80s, we did our share. We stacked apartments on top of apartments. We're still doing it. If you just go down those neighborhoods, you'll see 2 and 3 houses gone, and next thing you know, you have an apartment unit. So whether that meets the numbers or not, I think you reach a point where it's about more than numbers. It's more than completing a chart for the state that says, you had to get 3,000, you got 2,900, you're failing. That doesn't mean anything. It has no meat to it. It has nothing it says nothing about the impact in the community. We all talk about the fact that we have a wonderful community. It's been established for many years, has a great history. As noted by the historic preservation activity that took place in the last meeting, that really brings a sense of appreciation and of your own city. And I'm seeing that. Although I'm rambling here, I'm trying to get to a point. I think my sense is we need to take a stand. Now, whether tonight's the night to do that, I don't know, probably not. But I think what I'm sensing here is we need to come to some conclusion, have a discussion as to what we do about this. The city, instead of just throwing a number out and matching a number, there are certain neighborhoods where you shouldn't make 2 units out of 1 unit. These are just addresses, and I see why you did it in the element, and I think it's a great effort. But what I'm talking about is more like maybe we need to push back as opposed to giving them a response. Them being the state that. Go ahead, Tim.
I guess I would like to add that. You have to remember that the state legislature is composed largely of people who were locally elected officials at some point. So I think that there's a good understanding there of the constraints that we all face working on the local level. Although it is possible that, it is true certainly that some groups are pushing for a loss of local control. The people in the state legislature who are actually voting on it largely have the experience of being in your shoes and being on city councils. So I think just their perspective provides some of the balance that you were wondering about. Some of the direction that they've taken short of that is, in addition to us having to show available sites, they also pushed us here to show that our zoning was really effective. And an interesting piece of research that Laura and Jeff pulled together for this is in Appendix B of the housing element, where we're looking at just one of our incentive programs on lots wider than 90 feet, you get a few extra units. And they asked us, well, go back and look and see if this really works. Can people really get it? And the answer was yes. I mean, almost universally, everyone who was eligible for it was in reality able to meet every other zoning code standard too to get it. So, I mean, I personally would imagine that pressure from the state would be just to show that our numbers are realistic. And we've here focused on available lots just in residential zones because we had enough capacity there. But we've also, as you know, approved not housing programs, but housing design standards and densities for commercial and mixed-use zones, which add an enormous amount of capacity. So I think that Glendale actually is pretty well positioned to be able to meet significant housing demand in the coming years, while still being able to preserve the character of our single-family neighborhoods.
Also, two specific points that Commissioner Sheets brought up. One was, when is the pinnacle of this kind of direction that we think that has been happening at the state level? Well, we can't be sure, but we're hoping that whatever pressure existed during the height of the housing market might be easing down. It is true that the state underwent a major housing crisis in terms of both in terms of the availability of housing and housing prices. So the state legislator was under a lot of pressure to do something about it, so that supposedly the NIMBY communities will not be able to prevent people from having access to housing. Now that the housing market has collapsed and the pressure is not as heavy as it was in the past, maybe, hopefully, we're on the other side of the hump. We don't know. And I must say that the city has historically taken a very strong stand in our city. Both the city council and the city manager's office have been very active, directly and indirectly, through our elected officials in Sacramento and through other organizations, to make sure we're not losing the level of local control that our constituency wants here.
Just to kind of sum up, I appreciate your input, and I'm not saying the sky is falling and that the city hasn't done a lot of wonderful things, and I know you guys put a lot of effort into what we do and how we frame things. But having seen things like this happen in the city and notice how bureaucracy works, and you kind of catch the issue farther down the line than you would like to. To me, like these RENA numbers, I for some reason I just homed in on them, and I don't understand them completely as far as whether we have to do that or don't have to do that. But it just looked to me, if we proceed forward and we're told that we need to match these numbers, and we match the numbers on the high-level housing, we don't match the numbers on the low and the low level, it doesn't look good for us. I mean, it looks good, it looks like we're allowing houses to be built, maybe not to the extent they want, but somebody is not in support of the effort. So if we're allowed to build houses and we surpass the percentage of high-level houses that cost more, but we don't even come close to the houses that they're really looking for, we're setting ourselves up to have more heat and more pressure. So, and I'll just sum it up by saying, part of my fear is when you ruin a neighborhood, it's done. You put an apartment building in the middle of a neighborhood, it's done. You've broken the character. It may be a beautiful apartment building, but it was never meant to have an apartment building in it, and some that I'm thinking about right now, and they're gone. So my concern is can we do this cautiously? Can we think about some of the things that the chairman brought up? We want to keep the character. We've lost a lot of it, like most cities do. You have to evolve and you have to grow. But if we aren't careful, if we don't look at it specifically, our bureaucracy has a way of rolling forward. It's got a lot of momentum and a lot of pressure. And if people don't stand up and say, wait a minute, let's take a breather. Our city's different. We have done our share. When does it stop? Here's why we're not doing it. Here's what we want to do. And that takes a lot of work. We have to have objective as to why we want to put the brakes on. And so that's what kind of came to my mind as I was reviewing some of this. So I hope I've added some clarity to what my concerns are.
I just want to comment that we had staff presentation. I have no public cards. So in terms of commissioners and questions and interaction and thoughts, let's just make it a free-for-all. I know in terms, whether it's a study session or we're learning things or we're simulating, whatever it is, just, let's just be kind of free-form on it. I do know we have some representatives from, other parts of the city agency, I guess, here. If we're talking about some things, if you think that there's information that you have that would be beneficial to the discussion, just acknowledge it, come on up, we'll include you in the conversation. If there's something you definitely want to say, just let us know. Okay? Now, that said, Mr. Torgerson, I know you have some thoughts or remarks.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start on this. It's an impressive document. There was an awful lot of work done, very carefully done, I might add. I'm going to go in a couple of different directions, hopefully sequentially and not simultaneously. Mr. Keene mentioned the fact that there's two prongs to this problem: what's good for Glendale, and what do we have to do to answer the mail from Sacramento. And it's my impression that this particular document, and I'm not even sure I could support voting for sending it to the city council, it's extremely lopsided on the side of what do we do to make sure Sacramento's happy. It doesn't do nearly enough to protect existing neighborhoods, to provide guidance that we could use as hearing officers in a variance case, for instance, where we have to make findings that such and such a variance or plan or is in keeping with the general plan. And it's a little hard to see. Let me separate this, kind of summarize this document. You've got 6 goals for the city for housing, most of which, the majority of which, all have to do with answering the mail from Sacramento as far as affordable housing and inclusionary housing. Laudable goals. Each one of those goals, in order to implement those goals, you've defined some policies. And then underneath each policy, there's a set of plans, program plans, that you are going to suggest will help implement those policies. Everything else in the document is backup material. And if I'm judging whether or not a variance application meets the objective and intent of the general plan, specifically the housing element, it seems to me, and I'll look for a head nod from the city attorney, that I should be looking at the goals and policies as being the driving factors. All the analysis in the back and all the good intentions in the back and all the we really ought to do this in the analysis section doesn't seem to be legally binding as something that we would use to judge whether or not an application is meeting the intent of the housing element general plan. So,
actually, I had a couple of responses, not only to the question, but to some of your comments, so I was going to wait till you were done.
Okay, well, as far as, and then it's in terms of what I might refer to the city attorney as well, one of the analysis section that looks at how we did on last 7 years ago's housing plan, lists a bunch of policies and it says, well, the way we attack this policy is we passed this code and we did this and we did that. And over and over again it says this housing policy will be maintained. Now, some of those policies listed in here where it says this will be maintained are not listed as policies in the front. So I could stand up and argue that here's a policy that's in the housing element, or here's a policy that was listed in the previous housing element, and it's not in the current housing element, except as it's referenced in the analysis. How do I deal with that statement that this policy will be maintained? Is that a legally binding city policy, even though it's not in the policy and goals section?
I think as long as if there's a policy from the previous housing element, or I should say the existing housing element, that we're maintaining, it's not listed in the policies and goals of our proposed housing element, but it's still incorporated into some city policy, whether it's been incorporated into our zoning code, or oftentimes it's incorporated into the land use element, then it's still something that can be relied on when you're looking at specific case findings on a CEP or a variance. Because again, you're looking at the entire general plan, not just the housing element when you're looking at, and the zoning code, when you're looking at specific projects. So anything that's listed.
Well, we know it's against the code because they're asking for a variance to that code. So we know the code has to be looked at. But if it's, I find it hard to believe that I can sit up here and say, well, no, that's not in keeping with last year's, or the year 2000's housing plan, when it doesn't say that that is the policy in this current, or this proposed new housing plan.
Commissioner Torgerson, I can also add, when we looked at the goals and policies, we actually had a task force meeting, and that's all we focused on. We went through the old goals and policies and said, are these really applicable? Can these be updated? Is there a way to make them more reflective of what we have today? And so that's why you might see you will see several changes where we've added or streamlined some of the different policies. We've relocated them under different areas. So I don't know that we might, for some of the programs, we might have implemented the program, and so perhaps we took away a policy because the program was implemented. So for instance, if it was a policy for Hillside, we did adopt Hillside ordinances. So that might be a policy that we might have had a specific policy look at such and such neighborhood that was eliminated because the program was adopted, yet you will still see a policy in there that says that there's policies in there related to Hillside housing. That was just an example, but one of the
I didn't see a policy in here that's related to Hillside housing.
Yeah, and I think the general concept is if we had a policy or goal to do something and then we did it during the period, it may not show up as another policy. Another one may be to ensure compatibility of new multifamily development with existing multifamily and existing single-family. Well, then we adopted a series of regulations, both in our zoning code, design standards, and also the design review section to sort of implement that policy. So that may not be no longer reflected as a policy for the proposed housing element because it was implemented over the years during the plan.
Okay, so then if another city council comes along and decides, or another group comes along and decides that we need to change a piece of municipal code, then we can't go back and say, well, that's a policy in the housing element, the general plan, because it's not. It's a policy that was in the housing element before this housing element.
We would be looking at the 8-year housing plan. So that would be Chapter 2, the goals and policies in Chapter 2, where Chapter 3 is a review of the previous housing element. So I think you were looking at
So the
Chapter 3 where it says our intent is to maintain a program. Although we may have changed the policy or taken the program out, it's because it had been implemented. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily throwing out that item. It may be included in the 8-year housing plan under it as a different name. It may be a slightly different wording to the policy.
Okay, well, that...
So, I mean, the ideas of the housing task force, that's why we had a group look at those. They looked at the goals, they looked at the policies to say, were the old ones still applicable? How do we think it is today? Where do we want to go today? So it would be the 8-year housing program that when in the future, when we look at what is the housing element, what are the housing goals and policies, it would be Chapter 2 that we would be focusing on, because that addresses the current element, the 2006 to 2014 that we're looking at doing, whereas you're absolutely right in the way that the element is structured. The first part is really where are we going, and Chapter 3 is where have we been, and Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 are essentially the backup.
Right.
That is exactly how this element is structured.
Well, where are we going, to me, does not adequately protect the existing stock of housing and does not adequately address the what's good for Glendale part of the equation. All of the program plans to implement these various policies under the goals, they all seem to have to do with refurbishing distressed properties, building affordable housing, building multifamily housing, giving grants and low-interest loans and all sorts of subsidies to people to build more housing.
The goal of housing programs is to
There's no
address
programs
deficiencies.
to, okay.
So if there's a deficiency, I mean, if we think it's fine, we don't necessarily have a program for it. Because the goal of the program strategy and the programs to implement those strategies is where you see a deficiency in the element. It's where are we lacking something? Where do we need to focus our new attention? I think I mentioned before, you can read it like an action plan. This is what we need to do. If something is going, if we don't see a problem and haven't identified a problem, we didn't include a program for it. It's only if we saw a
Yeah, that
need for
makes
a
sense.
change or something to address. So I don't know if that clarifies it a little bit. It's not that we don't want to protect existing housing. We do have policies for that. But as far as implementing, if we didn't see or identify a program in our, or a problem in our element, then we wouldn't have a program strategy to necessarily address that.
Okay, so in summary, you're saying that the protection of existing housing stock, for instance, is by policy that's either in the 2006 to 2014 housing plan or by things that were implemented in the previous housing plan that are going to continue. And so the things that were implemented in the previous housing plan that are continuing can still be used as a basis for judging variances and CUPs.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Are you referring to something in particular? It would be helpful if you actually have a particular passage in the element that you are asking about, so that we can take a look and see if in fact there is a confusion on part of staff. We could clarify it and then maybe clarify it in the draft.
And I unfortunately left some of the notes at home, but I can get that information back to you.
That'll be very helpful.
Well, and also if you see it, if you think there's a deficiency in here that we do need a program for, we can certainly add that. I would just say if you feel that there's something that there's a hole in here, that we're missing something that should be a program strategy or included as a program under a program strategy, this is the time to look at that and the time to address that.
I think I'm hearing the issue that you're raising, Commissioner Turgeson, in a couple of ways. One, I'm hearing that we're making references to the housing, the existing housing element goals and policies, that we're saying certain policies we're keeping, and you're not necessarily finding a repetition of the same policy or goal in the current. So if there is if there is an understanding that we're maintaining it but we're not reiterating it, perhaps even if it's redundant, it's useful to reiterate it. And if we can identify a few of those, it'll be helpful. I think there's another category that is more like some of our understanding is that we had goals and policies in the previous housing element, and we think we have met those goals and policies either by making zoning code changes or coming up with changes to other elements, etc., that have established that, and we may not necessarily feel the need to repeat them. And if that's the case, then we could probably be a little bit more clear about that.
We could also go through Chapter 3 if you tell us which ones you're concerned about, and we can absolutely address those, the older or the previous element programs where we say that we intend to continue it. You could just let me know which one it is if you feel it's unclear, and we can definitely add a description of how we will continue it.
Well, here's an example, policy 3.5, ensure flexibility of zoning to accommodate.
Hold on just a moment. Commissioner Torgerson, could you give us a page so we can all work with you? Is that 59?
Page 59.
59, it's policy 3.5.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll double check that I'm in the correct section.
You're in Chapter 3.
In Chapter 3. Okay, Chapter 3, policy used to be meaning what's currently enacted, and will be, meaning this proposed document. It used to be ensure flexibility of zoning to accommodate a wide range of housing types and products, which we've done a good job of. And there's a whole review of that and talks about the different kinds of zones that have been established. And the city will continue to implement this housing policy. Now, if I go to Goal 3, Policy 3.5, in the proposed housing element, it completely eliminates that
Page
particular
14.
policy, which would be page 14. That's not a particularly it's not a really great example if you're talking about judging a variance or a CUP, but it's an example of the kinds of things that I wondered about. If there was a policy that's mentioned in the existing housing element, the new housing element says it will continue, yet it's not listed as a policy under the goals of the new housing element. That's where I was, my C lawyer.
So the question is, why was that policy eliminated?
Yeah. For instance, goals, if you want to go that way, the old goal number 6 was a city with housing that is sensitive to environmental and social needs, and we've lost the need to be sensitive to environmental needs, apparently, as a goal in the new housing element.
We have a whole section on sustainability now.
Because goal 6 is,
I'm sorry, would you?
are you folding environmental sensitivity?
Whole section on sustainability.
Does
Yeah, we
environmental?
created a whole new goal and policies under, so when the Housing Task Force looked at it, they moved a lot of things around. And we added a whole program strategy and goals for sustainability because that wasn't in the previous element. And so some of the policies that were existing that seemed to actually fall under a livable and sustainable category, that's, the Housing Task Force had listed that under Goal 6, which was, I mean, it was just it's
now,
renaming and some of the ones.
Is the promotion of environmental preservation the same thing as sustainability? Because the old element specifically addressed the promotion of environmental preservation, whereas sustainability to me is more like green building and good practices, double glazed windows and thick insulation and energy conservation.
I think the definition of sustainability is sort of in the eye of the beholder, but tends to be as broad as one wants it to be.
Well, there's
It's all things to all people.
Well, there's different definitions for the word. Obviously, your definition is correct, but sustainability can also be maintaining the status quo and allowing a neighborhood to sustain itself through its character and so on. So, whether you're thinking of sustainability in terms of being green and saving a tree, if you will, or whether you're thinking of it in terms of maintaining something in terms of sustaining.
Based on what I'm hearing, it appears that to the extent that the goals and the policies have been incorporated into the proposed new housing element, it's not always clear where they landed. So one way that staff could make sure that people can make the connection if they read the element is that we can cross-reference them. And then the second part as to whether or not the way that it landed is the best use of words and nomenclature is a different discussion. But in this example that you just mentioned, that would probably be the way to address it, that this goal or this policy is now reflected in such and such goal and policy of the proposed new housing element. So that way at least the reader can make that connection if it's not obvious based on the way that they're numbered.
Yeah, that'd be an excellent checklist or cross-reference to create, and you might find some of the holes I thought I found.
That's useful.
I have another question that's totally unrelated to the semantics and verbiage in here. Could you give us a summary of the financial arrangements that will be required to implement all these program plans? Are the monies for all these program plans coming from state funds, from local taxes?
And now we have some interest from one or the other.
I mean, got a very ambitious program plan, set of program plans in here over an 8-year period of time.
Boy, they were just almost napping back there, and you brought up who's going to pay for it.
Well, and I would say, just to follow up really quickly on your issue of that one policy on flexibility of zoning, we did move it under Goal 1 to Policy 1.1. It's provide a variety of residential development opportunities in the city through zoning of sufficient land with a range of densities. I think that's what we're tending to get. So,
Okay, that cross-reference will help me out.
And before you speak, just to add, it may be something as simplistic by the time it gets to council. It's just tell council, what did you drop and why? And then concentrate on what was added. All right, please, and identify yourself for the record.
My name is Ann Bockenkamp. I'm with the Community Development and Housing Department, and I've been active in the Housing Element Committee, but I may not know all the page references. I may have to ask Laura to help me on a couple of those. Obviously, the cost of meeting the requirements of affordable housing development in the arena is enormous. And I don't think there's anywhere in this document that we say that we have those resources available. I think we say that we have the land available and that we will make the best use possible of the resources that we have so that we can leverage additional monies and bring those resources into our community to attempt to reach those goals. But I think it's clear that that affordable housing is a challenging effort to make in the city of Glendale, especially considering the constraints that are described in this document, like lack of land and high construction costs and other issues here. There's a chart on page 125, actually 124 through 126, that shows projects that are in the development pipeline. And I think when you look at our housing plan, which we consider a 5-year of the 8-year plan, because that's about as far as we can project our money out, that's about as far as our pipeline goes, that describes projects that have either been completed to date or entitled to date or are in negotiations that we can show we are actually going to produce. And you can see that the numbers are much smaller than the need.
Now, by we are going to actually produce, you're talking about we, the city of Glendale, are going to allow the developer company that came in.
That's right. In partnership,
built it.
we will provide
We are not paying for that
financial
out of our
assistance.
Glendale taxes.
Well, some of it is redevelopment set-aside funds, which is property tax increment. But there are a number of resources that go into this, and we are assisting in private developers, nonprofit developers to produce this housing. We are a partner in this housing. So those are the numbers that we can say, 85, 95% sure that these units will be produced by this period of time.
Okay.
As far as the resources that are available, the financial resources that the city of Glendale can bring to this effort, there's a section in here.
yeah, it would be,
Is it in Chapter 4 also?
no, well, there's actually two different locations. There's Exhibit 2-4, which is on page 49, and it's it's been updated. It's the attachment a loose page that we gave you. And it's actual and projected redevelopment set-aside funds by program. It identifies how much money's been allocated.
This is money allocated out of property tax.
I believe it's redevelopment set-aside, so it's redevelopment money.
It's not state money.
Well,
Redevelopment property tax increment, that's
wanna
that's a result.
brief
I guess it is
overview
state.
of how the tax increment works.
Yes, please.
When the project area is, redevelopment project area is established, a base year for valuation, assessed valuation for property within that project area is established. So, the property, a piece of property is worth, $1,000, just as a rough example, at the time it's created. Then after the redevelopment area is established, development occurs, the development, when a piece of property in a project area develops and that assessed valuation for that property goes up, in a typical scenario without a redevelopment project area, that that property tax increment, that increase goes to all the different agencies, the school district, the city, and other taxing agencies. When it's in a project area, that increment goes to, except for some statutory pass-throughs that have to go to the school district, et cetera, go to the redevelopment agency. 20% of all that tax increment has to be used for the production, preservation, and improvement of the affordable housing stock within the city, within that project area.
And that's the set-asides.
That is the set-aside. Now,
20%.
was that?
20%.
20% of that. And I would point out that San Fernando has an affordable housing obligation. The central project area does not, because it was established before this requirement that 20% be set aside for that. So that's basically how it works.
Also on page 141 of the document, there are financial resources available for housing, and it has a list of probably about 6 resources that come to the city in a predictable manner. We do apply for these funds, but we can pretty much project how much money we will get annually, and we program that money to meet these goals. But it's far short of what we need, so we leverage money. We have developers provide equity and private funding for projects. We apply for additional state funds that come available through bonds that are passed, housing bonds that are passed statewide, and we compete for
That's
those
statewide.
funds and have received some of those.
And
Do
by
our
the way,
best.
should add, we need a certified housing element to qualify for some of those funding.
So there's the stick, okay.
But we are very aware of the gap and are working very hard to reach and fill that gap.
Yeah. So there's a gap, and the primary way of filling that gap would be the 20% set aside from increased property taxes on the redeveloped properties,
Home
as well
funds.
as begging for money from Sacramento.
That's right, and federal funds, Section 8 housing assistance, home funds, shelter plus care funds, supportive housing funds.
Bake
Those are
sales.
all the alphabet
Incentives to
soup
developers.
of federal and state
Bonus
funding.
incentives and stuff.
And bonus incentives. I see.
If I could add, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Torgerson, the central, I guess, tenet of the housing element law is, for the purposes of affordable housing production, is that you provide enough sites with enough density so that a developer, whether they come to the city for financial assistance or they get other sources of financial assistance, can build affordable housing. Both the state law and HCD, to some extent, equate density with affordability. So the more there's enough density, there's a more likelihood that you can build affordable housing. And I think in our city, we've seen typically affordable housing projects have had some level of assistance from the city, but that's not to say that's the only thing that's going to happen. I've seen in other cities where, assuming that the zoning and the general plan allow for the density, developers have received other sources of funding, tax credits, for example, without any financial assistance. So the primary concern that HCD has is that you have significant adequate sites. I mean, that's the purpose for doing the adequate site analysis, so that you have the density to support affordable housing.
We have also several density bonus projects that provide affordable senior housing that we did not provide direct financial assistance for. That's another tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you tell a developer, we'll let you put an extra 2 floors on your building, which
Right.
more income to you if you build senior housing on the bottom or something.
And I think there are incentive programs in some of your specific plans that provide the ability for developers to do affordable housing without direct financial assistance.
Thank you very much.
On this revised sheet 49 that we got, it noted that in 2006, 2007, the redevelopment funds produced 1.455 million, the redevelopment funds gave 1.455 million to production of affordable housing. How many units, if you happen to know? And I'd have a similar question for 2007-8 with over 10 million.
I can give you a per unit approximate investment that we would make.
Like 140 grand a unit or something
Correct.
like that?
$166,000 per unit
That's
for
up
rental.
20%
and
since last time.
$200,000 per unit for home ownership, moderate or low income home ownership. Because the pipeline takes a couple of years, actually sometimes 3 or 4 years, from the time you come up with a concept to the time you actually have units available for occupancy. They don't necessarily translate directly to the year that the funds become available to the number of units. So you can see the number of units that are in our pipeline. They may not specifically match the exact year when the funds became available.
So for 2007 and 8, the $10 million translates into about 60 units, plus or minus.
You can do the math better than
Yeah,
I
I'm
can.
testing you on that. So.
Thanks.
You weren't told there was going to be math, I understand. But I guess all I'm seeing here is 60 units, 40 units, 25 units.
Right.
It's a small donation. You were about to say, Mr. Lee?
Yeah, I have a question. This may be very basic question, but it is something that will help me to try to, find, I guess, what this is all about. I'm trying to fill the leg of the elephant right now, trying to imagine the actual image of the elephant here. But I'm looking at, while in your conversation, I'm looking at this, your funding sources to be all, mostly actually it's a federal funding. And then yet you are going by the guidelines of the HCD, which is a state, guideline. And I guess my question is that, because I guess all this conversation I've been hearing is that you were trying to comply or, meet the guidelines of the HCD. Do we get attaboy points and then get some funding from state saying, hey, you guys met this level and this is how much money that we have available and this is what we'll give you? Is that what we're trying to do? I'm trying to look at the relationship between the HCD state, how they are governing this program, and then all the funding sources are coming really from home and,
Well,
HUD and all this is coming from the federal side.
Just as we do a housing element that covers several years, we do a consolidated plan that talks about how we're going to do federal funding. So, but that doesn't necessarily come to the Planning Commission. Our consolidated plan should be similar to in conformance with the housing element. So we've used a lot of the consolidated plan information, which describes how we're going to apply our federal funding, as a basis for this document. As far as attaboy points, when we apply for competitive funding, a residential development loan program that we're using for one of our Doran projects, a home ownership project, they looked at how we were leveraging other funds. So if we have federal dollars in a project as well as state dollars, we're more likely to get funding for that project.
I see.
I think that's about as attaboy as we get. So.
Follow up to that, then you mentioned a shortfall a couple of times, and I wasn't really clear as to what the magnitude of that shortfall is.
In terms of a dollar
In
amount?
terms of the dollar amounts, if you look at this.
What dollars it would take to produce the RENA? I've never done that calculation. I can go back there and do it and get that information to you, but I haven't.
No, it would just, as a matter of policy, it would concern me to vote for a plan or a document that creates a significant financial burden on the city because we have a big shortfall. We've told the state we're going to do this, and now all of a sudden we don't have the money, so what do we do?
Yeah, I
And
think
that's
what
kind of
we're-
where I'm coming from.
I think what we're telling the state is that we will make every effort to do that, and we've given them programs, and we've programmed dollars to meet that goal, to meet those goals as best we can. But like all communities in the state, there's just not enough money.
No, the
I
state
think-
doesn't have it.
That's right, and I think that they must recognize that as they do their review. So this is not a problem that's unique to us. It's statewide. In fact, it's probably national. But we are making every effort to stretch our dollars as far as we can.
Okay. And please don't take any of my comments as a criticism of this
Yeah.
document. It's a learning experience for me because I've never seen
And I think they're important
all these
questions. I think we
plans
all
get
have.
implemented.
I think we all have to struggle with them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions for the speaker?
I just had one point on that just to carry on. I have a sense, and I can't describe it as far as the shortfalls on the low income, the very low income, relative to the above moderate income. We can surely exceed those on a regular basis on these charts. We go beyond them, and we can afford to do that, which I understand. The economics are, if you build the house, you do the study, and people are going to go there. So there's a process that occurs that the state says you need to have another percentage of houses that fall in the low-income area. We don't meet that. The developers don't want to meet that. We're not successful in our endeavors to make that happen. but we're very successful in matching and more, actually exceeding the requirements of housing that is above moderate. So I guess I have a question there. I'm not sure what it is, but it seems to me that somebody would look at that and say, you're pulling a game here. What are you doing?
Well, I
You
think
have housing, you have opportunity, you have space, you have people who want to develop, but you're just not willing to go there.
I think
That frightens me. It's not that I want to go there, it's just that it creates a question in my mind.
I think what they look at when they review these is, have you provided higher density areas so that you have the best opportunity to stretch those dollars? Have you taken the existing dollars that you have and programmed them to create affordable units as best you can? Do you have the tools in here, flexible zoning, streamlining and removing barriers to development to make those dollars go as far as they can?
I think we're doing that. If you
Okay.
look at the effort towards housing involved with commercial. We don't take credit for that in this document, but I think there's a great effort in the city to go there, and I'm becoming more and more enamored by that process relative to going and changing the neighborhood, the look of the neighborhood. So that's an area, maybe that and maybe some other things, like you say, that we can take credit for.
And I think in Glendale, we've been very lucky that, as far as affordable housing goes, we've developed a really good team method of getting these projects to be as desirable as possible, and yet getting them through as quickly as possible, and with the limited resources we have, stretching those dollars as far as we can and producing a good product because we work together, because we know how important it is.
Right, and without variances, that'll be fine. Thank you.
Mr. Regano.
Yes, Commissioner Sheets' comment and question, actually, if I may, I'd like to comment. I think you see a lot more of the elephant than you're willing to admit. But I think there are two things that are happening here. One is that, yes, as Ms. Buckenkamp said, that they want to see if the city is making an adequate effort to address these things through the programs. And they understand that you can only succeed to the level that you can succeed as long as you're trying. And I think that's why we urge you to vote for this as opposed to against this, because we want to show that we are doing these programs. The second is that the issue you mentioned about the introduction of housing in the commercial zones. That really underlines the relationship between the housing element and the other elements of the general plan. And the other elements of the general plan give us the tools to somehow take our local needs into consideration. For example, yes, we are providing additional opportunities for housing, but we are looking at protecting the character of our neighborhoods by directing the pressure of growth to where it's not going to impact the neighborhoods as much. And that's something that you will hear a lot more about as we get into the other elements of the general plan over the next year.
And things like continuing the reluctance to allow second units, which is particularly bad in the hillside areas from a density of traffic standpoint. I'm tired of this, Mr.
Take a break. I'm sure other people have some observations.
I think in general, I would also commend the staff on a thorough job and a good job at trying to tease out all of the elements, so to speak, that make up a broader housing element. Clearly, there are some things that are sort of policy level that I had hoped, and maybe we still will get to in terms of a discussion, and second units might be among those, and inclusionary zoning is something that I think merits further discussion. But the debate has gone a different direction so far, and that's fine too. I think it's good to get a firm understanding of what the impetus for the policies and programs are and what's driving it. Clearly, cities, communities, the state, and the nation beyond are not static. We grow, we continue to grow, and we need to figure out a way to accommodate that growth in a way that makes sense. And so I think that's something that is a legitimate state interest, and I'll be the first and perhaps the only up here to defend the state of California. I think The state does have legitimate interest. It does have legitimate public policy goals to ensure that there's adequate housing to accommodate the growth that the state experiences, and housing at all levels and all incomes. I don't think that anybody would dispute the state has a legitimate concern there. And to the extent that they impose requirements or seek to impose requirements on local governments, they do so because some local governments are more recalcitrant than others to help satisfy legitimate state interests. I do want to raise the question on inclusionary zoning. I know I've raised this before, and in particular when we approved the San Francisco corridor mixed-use zoning, and we said here's where we will have inclusionary zoning. Admittedly, there was a change in state law that helped propel our doing so. But to me, it stands out in some ways as a sore thumb in terms of our application of inclusionary zoning, simply because I'm concerned that it could be perceived as an environmental justice issue, that the only place that we will actually require affordable housing is in the San Fernando corridor. And I don't know that that's exactly the message that the city wants to send. I think we lost a big opportunity, and I know when the Americana project came through, I for one, thought we should require affordable housing there, and we didn't get it. And I understand that there's that wasn't the will of the commission or the council, but I thought that was an opportunity to suggest that a mixture of housing types is good for a community, that we're not homogeneous, and we need to recognize that we're not homogeneous. So I would like to revisit the question of inclusionary zoning, at least at the commission level, and have that discussion. I also would like to have the discussion about second units. I understand there are times when second units may not be appropriate, and hillsides may certainly be those opportunities. I think we have special zoning in hillsides, and we may be able to limit second units to areas where it might make more sense. And then just kind of a minor comment, really, I did appreciate the sort of further calling out of sustainability, however defined. I did note there that one of the things we say in order to achieve that goal is that we'll comply with state law, AB 32, whatever comes down with regard to complying with state law. And to me, mere compliance with state law is a given. It's not something that we should beat our chests over and say that we're not going to flaunt the law, and that's not going to help us get to our goals, because everybody's going to comply with state law. And the green building, I think the council has given direction that we want to promote sustainable building strategies, green building strategies, and I didn't see that reflected in the actual policies. I think we didn't say we were going to do this, or that even we were going to investigate incentive programs or requirements for sustainable building practices, and I think that's one that we could add in as well in some fashion. So I think I would welcome a discussion on several of those issues.
At a future date, you mean? Right.
Now or at a future date?
Well, I wasn't sure what you were suggesting.
I was suggesting that we have a housing element in front of us that I would think the commission might want to talk about, whether inclusionary zoning is something that should be included, and second units should be included in the housing element at this time.
Fair enough. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were asking.
Yeah, I'm here till October 1st, so anytime between then and now.
This meeting will be over by then.
Okay.
Any further comments from you at this time, Mr. Lee?
Well, I have more questions than comments here. So,
First meetings have a way of doing that.
Yeah. So, it's been. I've been listening to other commissioners and trying to swallow, I guess, absorb everything that's been said here. Still, it's a lot to absorb. So I have to do a lot of homework. But some of the things that I could relate to is what just Commissioner Giro said about the inclusionary zoning and also second units. I think, because what I've learned today is that there's absolutely no second unit allowed in city of Glendale, And I think there are some properties out there with really large, parcels that that I think you can make some exceptions to. So, I kind of relate to that. But for right now, like I said, I have a lot more areas to, I guess, fill so that I can fully describe the elephant now from the next meeting on.
Well, I guess I join in what was said by Commissioner Jarrow about the, at least having a little bit of a conversation about the second units, the condo conversion. I mean, let's spend a few minutes talking about it. It's not part of the program. I'm not sure that we, as the Planning Commission, would be predisposed to put it in, but I think it would be worthwhile to talk about it a little bit and find out, maybe if it resonates, we're going to suggest that it be included.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Good. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, that's fine. And I will say that my default, I guess, in human nature is to not change things. So while I certainly can appreciate there may be properties that second units may make sense in, my predisposition is to say no, and then say, okay, now tell me what the properties are and what are their characteristics, and does it make sense or not?
Exception basis.
On an exception basis as opposed to zoning, whether it's spot zoning, whether it's a use variance, or whether it's, by a more systematic approach to zoning.
And you can't have guest houses.
Right.
You can have guest houses.
You could.
You can.
Oh,
The city places constraints on guest houses. They must be single-family zones. They're limited to 500 square feet of floor area, and you can't rent them. So basically, if you want a guest house in your backyard for your mother-in-law to live in, that's...
Your teenager.
Yeah, your teenager. Better idea. That's okay. Second units, as far as building a rental apartment on the back.
500 square
40
foot is not really that. It's only a little hut.
And it doesn't help solve the affordable housing.
Playhouse. So with my fellow commissioners' permission, I don't know that we need to do it right now, but I'd suggest quite shortly in this session, I'd like to spend a few minutes and have staff bandy about the second unit aspect of things.
Mr. Foy went to get the code so we can actually completely identify what it is that we do allow in Glendale. But I think you have the gist of it. Pretty much, we do allow guest houses, a guest unit, which implies that the most affordable it gets is that you can give it for free to a member of your family or someone you really like. But it's not necessarily meant to work the way that second units are discussed at the larger policy level so that you can provide smaller, more affordable rental units. That has not been exactly something that has been received very well in Glendale from our constituents in the past.
Right, our guest house, if somebody builds a guest house, they're not allowed to have a kitchen, so it cannot be an independent living unit. And that's where the difference is between what you could have with a second unit and what we have, a guest house.
And yet we, as a matter of policy, support the development of affordable housing and include that in our housing element as a goal of the city. And so it seems contrary to the goal.
Well, but what the contrariness is probably the density of doing that. If you're talking a single family, like an R1R or an R1 zone, and you're going to suddenly allow that, you're increasing density beyond what you really probably want to do in that neighborhood. At least that to me would be the concern.
Yeah, right now under our zoning code, if you're in a single-family residential zone, you're allowed one unit. And so essentially, if you're adding a granny flat or a second unit, then you'd be adding 2 units. You're doubling the density.
I just wanted to...
Potential. So that would be our concern with that. And the other issue is, in certain areas it may be fine, I guess it would depend on individual lot characteristic, but one of the things we have in our code is we have, for single family, and Tim will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the interior setback is 6 feet. So on some houses, some lots where it's pretty well developed out, where do you put the unit? So I guess that it just depends on a lot of individual lot characteristics of whether certain neighborhoods even could accommodate them, depending how a site was originally divided.
Right.
So I would
And
just-
I wouldn't suggest that it's appropriate in all instances, but I do think that there are opportunities in certain parts of the city on certain lots, and a blanket prohibition doesn't further our goal for affordable housing and doesn't reflect the potential for the opportunity.
But, and correct me if I'm wrong, even with the blanket prohibition, they could still apply for use variance.
Possibly. One way that, again, this is a relationship between the housing element and the land use element. One of the areas that we're going to be looking at when we come back to do the rest of the general plan, in the land use element, we are going to be looking at areas of the city that are zoned for higher density housing that's currently presently you see physically on those properties. And one way that we are
Sorry, say that again.
you might go in parts of the city where the zoning allows higher densities than you actually see there.
Like an R-1250 with single-family
Correct.
houses.
So in some of those areas, we're going to be looking at actually the possibility of allowing second units or third units in a way that you maintain the existing units as a way of conserving the neighborhood character. I know it's not exactly what Commissioner Jerry you're talking about, but that is one way that we think we can balance some of the needs and demands of our community to maintain neighborhood character and at the same time allow additional units on properties that get closer to what the code allows, and maybe looking at ways of relaxing some of the other standards that would allow additional units without demolishing the existing units. I don't know if that completely responds to what you're talking about, which is really production of additional units in single-family residential homes to allow perhaps up to 2 households on every lot, which would make more affordable housing available.
Right, and I think we can do that in a way that's prescriptive, so you set standards for a minimum lot size in which it would be allowed, so smaller lots where it doesn't make sense simply don't have it by right, but larger lots that are deeper where it is can be accommodated, those kinds of requirements can be defined. And it seems to me that if we have an interest in promoting affordable housing, then we need to at least open the door to looking at that and not just say no.
Well, how does, I guess, how does it get interpreted when you have, you said you could have a second house, 5.5 feet, but if you have the main house and if you remodel it and restructure it to be a duplex or a triplex, how does that still consider as a second unit, or?
Could you remodel a single-family?
Do you understand my question?
To have
Well,
Yeah,
you
you have
entries.
you have a building, a large house, let's say, and then
That's like-
now you open it under the kitchen in there, so completely separate, housing.
Are you saying that without telling
It's like a
anyone
unit.
that it's by stealth?
It doesn't have to be
And I'm not
detached.
suggesting you're planning.
No, getting the permit for that, but it does a duplex, triplex, how.
Well, you wouldn't be able to do that unless
Depends on
it's
the
in
zoning.
a.
It depends on the zoning.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to necessarily be a detached unit to be a second unit. It could be attached
Okay.
if it was a single-family zone, if it was permitted. But the problem is, right now, it's the number of kitchens. If they're 2 separate living units, it's considered 2 units. If it was in an R1 zone, that would be prohibited, because at this point, you're only allowed to have 1 dwelling unit per lot in the single-family residential zones. You could have a guest house, which would be limited, I believe it's 500 square feet. But again, that's not independent living. It would not be allowed to have a kitchen. And in fact, when they find people who have built a guest house and then bootlegged in a kitchen, code enforcement goes out and makes them remove the kitchen. So it's one of those things where, do they exist? Yeah, they're probably out there. But at this point, our code doesn't allow it.
I heard what you said about the land use element coming up, and I think second units fits in there. I mean, we're talking about housing element and trying to create opportunities, and that's fine, but I think the land use element's a great place for that conversation.
It sounds like a punt to me, but
Well, I mean,
Because we'll have one
I-
element that prohibits it and another that we can reopen, I suppose.
Well, but I don't know that the housing element itself, well, I guess the housing element does prohibit it, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't prohibit it. It explains that we didn't consider
I'm
it.
sorry, Mr. Garcia?
I don't know the exact details of the prohibition. I believe it was an ordinance that we adopted. It's not in. It's no longer. It's not in the code because it's not permitted. But I was going to address this issue on second units when we adopted the second unit prohibition. We were required to make a finding that the second units were not necessary to meet our housing need, and that was a number of years ago. I don't know, Laura, if you know how long ago that was, but that determination would probably now be not subject to legal challenge because it was so long ago. One of the risks, this is not meant to dissuade you from talking about second units, but I need to put this out there. If the city were to go down the road of re-examining second units, and then tried it and then decided it didn't work within the city, we'd have to go back and make those findings again, which you see more and more organizations looking closely at those findings. Second issue was related to second units. There's been actually a change in the landscape of second units since we adopted our ban, and that was a number of years ago. I'd say 5 years ago. The state legislature adopted AB 1866, which put significant limitations on what local bodies can do with respect to second units. The primary one is that cities that do allow second units are required to allow them by right. No conditional use permit, no discretionary review. You can have standards. You can say, for example, going on Commissioner Dro's comment that they not be allowed in some areas but allowed in others. You can limit the size. You can require a certain amount of parking. But there are significant limitations on what the cities can do. So that's something else you're going to want to take a look at if you do examine allowing second units in the city.
Maybe I can ask actually a question about how we measure success of our meeting the goals and recognize that the RENA numbers that we got in the last go-round were not reasonable and probably not based on proper assumptions. Have we done an assessment of the current RENA numbers, or at least the methodology used in generating the current RENA numbers, back applied them to what it would have been for the previous housing element period and looked at whether or not we met targets under that methodology?
I did not look at it that way. All we did was we cataloged what has actually been built. So we did do an analysis of what has been built under the previous period, but we did not look at perhaps what had been entitled and what wasn't built. We didn't look at changes in the law. Did that encourage development? We didn't do that sort of analysis. All we did for this element was we looked at the adequate sites analysis. So we looked at where we have capacity for future growth, not for what went on in the past. If we did not have a certified housing element, we would have had to include that analysis. But since the City of Glendale is in compliance with our housing element, we do have a certified housing element, we were not required to do that analysis.
So that said, we know in the past planning period what the production was. How do those numbers compare to what's in the current planning period or the proposed planning period?
I don't know offhand. I'd have to look.
Isn't that somewhat like, is it going to rain next month?
Well, that's why I sought to apply the methodology to
I
the
can look
previous
back and
period.
say, yeah, they
No,
said
it's
it was
it's
going to
in the
rain.
file.
It didn't. But tricky,
Well, but I see
tricky proposition.
I think it's a good question, because I still think a lot of this hinges around, are we performing in a way that we're making a valiant effort to meet the RENA numbers, or are we not? And I think what the answer to that question in some ways is going to be impact how we're treated. And my gut feeling is, if I see the numbers the way they are and the drastic separation in the numbers matching up the objective, my sense is they'll be the same. Because I'm not seeing anything that says we've done anything different to try to meet those.
Well, might be able to shed some light on it. We do have a certified housing element. Our previous element was certified. It did meet the law. However, the law that was applied then is different than the law that exists now. And so, for instance, we didn't have the adequate sites analysis where we had to say what was on individual parcels. And I don't know offhand, I don't know the old element well enough to be able to tell you what the assumptions were that went into the zoning that was done at that time. However, I can say they were acceptable to the state. So whatever rationale was used at that time worked. However, it's a new game because the state has discovered, and I'm not saying Glendale did this, but I'm saying a variety of communities did, they discovered that, when communities said there were adequate sites, a lot of times they would zone high schools multifamily residential. They would zone large commercial buildings, parks, multifamily residential. So, and that wasn't Glendale. I'm just saying that there were discrepancies discovered in various communities throughout California, and so that's why the adequate sites analysis was modified and state law was changed, so you actually have to say what is on the individual sites. That's why this is a very specific analysis in Appendix A, because we had to say an address, we had to say the number of units, we had to say how big the lot is, what is there now, and we had to identify what the constraint could be in the future. Could it actually be used for the purpose we're saying? And in this case, it would be the number of residential units we're identifying. So things like commercial buildings don't show up here as something that is likely to be modified for maybe an additional unit. However, a commercial site, something that is commercial use, maybe a non-conforming commercial in a multifamily area, might be suitable for a higher density multifamily. So you'll see that in the land use if you actually look through Appendix A and some of the description that we've provided an explanation of adequate sites analysis.
Right.
If I may add a comment, one of the I believe the question was something akin to what were the numbers then and what did we produce and what was the gap, something like that. And this is the kind of dialogue that, quite frankly, is in the heart of the argument that local jurisdictions have with the advocacy groups, which is to say that we want to maintain the requirement of local jurisdictions at the level that we simply show that we have adequate sites that provide sufficient opportunity for new housing to be developed. However, the local jurisdiction cannot be asked to be responsible for whether or not they're actually produced, because that includes so many different variables that are outside the control of the local jurisdiction. And if, in fact, the housing element starts analyzing things at that level, it implies that we were responsible for it to the extent that the numbers were not met, which would not be correct. And to give that level of ammunition to the people who want to take away local control was not something that we were after.
Right. And I fully understand that point, and I appreciate that this is not a numbers game. My purpose in asking the question is we make the claim that we're doing everything we can, that we're being a proactive city to support affordable housing. How do we measure the success of the programs that we have, and when can we leave some tools on the table rather than use them, such as second units?
I don't know that this really addresses your intent question, but there are some goals that were presented in the last housing element or the current housing element, and we have reported on how we did on those goals. I think today we would present, in fact, we did present our goals differently. But there is, on page 71, production of affordable housing strategy number 2, a specific list of goals that were done in, 1998, 2000, and what we did. And we met all of our goals except there was one for single-family rehabilitation that we fell short by about 20 units. I don't know that gives a lot of I don't think it addresses your issue, but certainly we did track how we did on our goals, and we can report on that.
No, I appreciate that.
At page 75, it's section 3.3, differences between proposed actions and accomplishments. I mean, it is sort of a summary, but all it is a summary of how are we doing in implementing our programs. We didn't go to the larger analysis of how many units did we actually build.
Right. And I think that's good, and I think it's important that we do report on how well our programs are performing. What that doesn't address is what programs we're not implementing, such as a second unit, because we're simply not addressing those. And those are other tools that are available to us that we've decided, for policy reasons, we're not going to use. But it doesn't help us understand how well we're doing overall, because we're not playing the numbers game. I understand.
Right, and just so you know, in terms of the state law for what we used as a baseline for adequate density, the state law says if you have by right density of 30 units or greater, it's assumed that you can build affordable units under that density. And so for us, that's the R1250 zone. And it's also when a by right development under R1650 when you have a lots over or a development with greater than 90 feet of frontage, a lot consolidation. And so you'll see quite a lot of analysis in there if that's how we feel we meet our regional housing need. And we've also included in Exhibit 4-32, which goes over the number of units, assisted units, and also some of the larger projects downtown where we have multifamily housing. We've identified the numbers of units there, and we're including those as basically offsetting our RHNA. And when it comes to what we've actually counted toward affordable units, we've only counted those that are assisted units or in some respect have a contract of some kind for affordability. Right. Because otherwise, if we were going to just say we have more affordable units and take a guess, we would have to actually provide the backup data for that. And since we don't own units as far as we're not out there building them and renting them ourselves, other than for assisted units, we don't know or have control over what the rents are and have that knowledge, and it would cost additional money if we were going to do surveys. And so we said, well, if we already have the adequate zoning, we already have the adequate sites, we already meet the needs, we're going to limit our analysis to that because there isn't a requirement that we go further. However, there is description in the element on an aggregate level that we do have additional zoning capacity of up to even 50 units per acre in some of our mixed-use zones, and even greater than that in downtown. Although we did not identify individual sites for that, we also identified that we have additional capacity in commercial zones, like you had mentioned, that we have a lot of residential units going in commercial zones. However, when you look at mixed use and you look at commercial, we don't know that residential is necessarily the highest and best use. Could be a lot of uses that could go in there. And also on those sites, the existing use tends to be something that's more intense than residential. So would those actually be adequate sites that would convert to a residential use? Without quite a bit of analysis on a site-by-site basis, we don't know that's true. So that's the reason in our element we haven't included those site-specific mixed-use zoning and single-family or a commercial zoning in the adequate sites analysis in Appendix A. We've kind of left it. We focused just on the multifamily zones, said we meet it in the multifamily zones, we have no need to go further. Although what the HCD level or letter came out, they said they wanted us to identify all that and put all the sites in the adequate sites analysis. And again, it comes back to, well, where is the state going with this in the future? Do we really want to put all this? Do we really want to put all the addresses? Do we really want to have a huge document that says lots and lots of units are available? Well, maybe not, because we don't know where the state's going to go. And in terms of having more local control, maybe we're better off just meeting. If we meet the requirement, then we'll put in how we meet the requirement. And unless we have another impetus to go further, I think that satisfies our need as well as the state's need at this point. I don't know if that's...
I might just to kind of tag on to Commissioner Giro's point, if I'm catching it right, there's an opportunity that we're not using with the second unit, and there's a lot of feelings about that. Like in this case, it's an area that we're not using. So my sense is that maybe we should consider that. Maybe since they're new, we don't have a lot of data on how successful they are, but maybe that would be something in the future that whatever we decide to do with second units, we would include that in whatever data we find out. I'm not saying do it, but it might be worthwhile to do that, and now it looks like we're making multiple efforts to meet some of those shortfalls.
Please.
My sense is that at the moment, we do not need second unit consideration in this plan. If, for argument's sake, the state said you must have 1,000 home sites available for the next 2 years or whatever, and we go and do this inventory like you've done in here, and by use of the current zoning of our 1250 and our 1650 with density bonuses, we come up with that, here's 1,000 units that could be built. We've answered the mail, we've done what the state wanted us to do, and we've taken care of the requirements of the housing element. Now, as a political issue, if you come back a couple of years later and address Mr. Jarrow's how did we do, meaning not how did we do answering the mail with the state, but how did we do in terms of providing, facilitating the provision of affordable housing, then you might go in and say, well, shoot, out of those 1,000 units, they were all it would have had to have been a big condominium, and it's really expensive to build, and none of the builders wanted to come in and do it, and we didn't have any money to subsidize. So how else are we going to enable affordable housing? That's when you might come in and say, well, okay, how do you build them cheaper? Oh, maybe we use second units in appropriate areas and deal with that as a land use issue, where you come up with a targeted zoning study and say, well, these are the areas where you could have a second house, turn a big lot into a flag lot, whatever the case may be.
Well,
I think that's the best approach.
Well, actually, I have two disparate thoughts on that. The first is, I prefer to keep, on the concept of local control, I prefer to keep a conversation like second units away from the state. And they're already, here's the way I operate. The farther the seat of government is away from where I live, the less I trust it. I have a reasonable amount of trust that at least I'll know what's happening in Glendale. By the time it gets to Sacramento, and don't even get me started about Washington, okay? So local control is paramount. So I would not want to see this get into the element unless we're forced into a corner. The second part of that, though, is I see a breakdown, at least in my definition. And again, we have to look at specifics. What's the specific property and how would it go? A big breakdown in the idea that putting a second unit on a property is suddenly going to be an affordable unit. My presumption would be it would be market rate. So the idea of using the second units as a springboard toward affordability, there would be a disconnect depending on what the specifics of the property were. So those are my two quick observations on second unit.
I agree there's a lot of issues. My initial inclination, if it isn't obvious, is definitely no, for a lot of historic reasons that I've seen. But those would come out in a discussion, and I don't know the points that Commissioner Jarrow would bring up or what his thoughts are on it, but I agree. I wasn't saying that it needed to be there. I was just saying that there would be multiple areas that we might be looking at that might be either evidence or data that might be supportive in the future, just comparing that one might be one and the other. But I don't feel that we should go in that direction at all.
And I think my only point is that it seems to me this is an opportunity for us to open the door to do some of that analysis and consider it, not suggesting that we put in the element that we will, in fact, allow second units. I think we don't know that until we've done the analysis when and where it's appropriate and whether or not we need it. And I'm still not fully convinced other than for the letter of the law, I presume the element, the way it's written, meets the letter of the law, so we don't need it to have an approved housing element, but we may need it for the spirit if we really want to promote affordable housing. So I would suggest that as part of our recommendation that we recommend that the planning department put into its work program for the next fiscal year an analysis of second unit policy and determine whether and where and they may be appropriate and whether they're necessary to help us achieve our goals.
Were you proposing to add this as a program as suggested by public council? I mean, maybe modify, because they're suggesting that we add a second units program.
No,
Are they- Or is it just not with housing element at all?
No, I think that could be, if that's going to be in the work program, then I think that could be a program in the housing element that we will conduct this assessment. Conducting the assessment doesn't predetermine an outcome.
Straw poll wise, I don't think there's support to include that in terms of a planning commission motion. Certainly, in the course of whatever we send to city council, there can be, let's say, the minority report, if you will, and the fact that we're talking about this, and the fact that there may very well be a role for it, I think should be on the table. It should be brought up in future conversations, whether it's related to land use elements, whether it's just a program in and of itself.
And also, it would be interesting to see why second units make more affordable housing than do condominiums.
Typically just because they're smaller.
Yeah,
and that raises the...
That's actually a fallacy, because smaller just means lower price. It doesn't necessarily mean it's lower per square foot. I mean, you're going to have a kitchen in every house. You're going to have a bathroom in every house. So your per square foot price of a smaller unit is a lot higher. In absolute terms, it's cheaper, but you're paying a lot more for a lot less.
And this is where you can get a student or someone who can afford $700 or $1,200 a month is able to live there. But that's all part of the analysis that would have to go on. And I don't mean to simply focus on second units either, because I think there are other opportunities. The inclusionary zoning is one where we could, in fact, do something very proactive to ensure the generation of affordable housing units, much more so than under a second units ordinance. And I think that's one where we need to do the analysis as well. Now, I know the council has considered that more recently than it's considered the second units, and so perhaps there's less appetite at that level to look at an assessment of whether and how inclusionary zoning could be applied on more broadly throughout the city, whether it's in redevelopment areas or beyond. But I'm struggling with what opportunities do we have that we're not including, and how do we get about at least understanding what they can provide for us in terms of benefit, what are the trade-offs, and whether or not we're in fact achieving the goals that we've set forth. And none of that do I think I understand today, given the level of information that we have.
Any other comments, gentlemen? Other observations? Anything you want to build on to what's just been said? I just hate pregnant pauses.
Somebody birth
It's
a
like
baby.
being on. Yeah, exactly. Were there other observations you wanted to make?
No, those are the primary. I mean, I raised the stuff on the sustainability. I do think that, saying that we'll comply with AB 32, whatever it is not a terribly proactive approach. We're not going to fail to comply with state law.
Well, and you know what? I appreciate the idea of proactiveness. I mean, that's something that we should all look within ourselves to do. I truly believe that the planning staff has, been pretty proactive in terms of some of the things they've been trying to do within the city. And it is an appropriate time when you look at housing element to do soul searching. But the thing that keeps underlying this is we've got, and it goes back to what I said earlier, we've got the state looking over our shoulders and telling us what to do and inflicting their will upon us. And the more we give them, the more they're going to take. So as far as I'm concerned, we should keep, tools and approaches and ways of dealing with our community, in our community, and not put it into something where the state can throw it back in our laps. When they mandate it, 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, that's when we can worry about it. Something that was said earlier by Commissioner Sheets got me starting to thinking, and I paraphrased, Patrick Henry. And, of course, he said, give me liberty or give me death. In my case, I'd say give me local control or give me death. And at some point, there's going to be a tipping of the scales, and it's going to be time to light the torches and take the ox carts on the road and do something with Sacramento. Until that time, we need, the individual cities, the League of Cities, and our planning staff to, give us the control to live our lives and improve our community without having somebody that's 500 miles away telling us what to do. We're fair players. I appreciate that the state has to look after, let's say, the bad apples. I won't name other communities, but we're a fair player. We're doing things above board. We're trying to make our community better, and we don't need the state coming down on our backs. Simply put.
How do you really feel?
Discussion of the,
The state is an elected body, not a British monarchy, but besides that, you
Really? How many state legislators were voted out of office that weren't termed out in the last few elections? It's a de facto monarchy. But now we're getting off case.
Off
So
case.
we'll talk about this over a cup of coffee.
Or a beer.
Oh, it won't be tea.
No.
I'm sorry to wax there a little bit. And now I'll wane. Any other comments, conversations? We do need to...
one thing we haven't discussed is the mitigated negative declaration.
Please.
It's not a mitigated, it's
But
a
I have
negative
no-
declaration.
A negative declaration.
You have comments on the mitigated?
No, I don't.
Oh, and okay,
I
good.
thought maybe somebody else would.
I do.
Do you, please?
Yeah, at the risk of keeping us here much longer than we planned on, I need a point of clarification. This is the second or third negative declaration that I've looked at. I had a question on the other ones because it involved 1 or 2 units. I just need a point of clarification. If I look at the item P, page 39, relative item 4, I have sufficient water supplies available to serve the project from existing entitlements and resources, or newer expanded entitlements needed, and it's less than significant impact. And then I read the next page, the mitigation. The statement is have sufficient water supplies, which I read, and we continue to say that the 1,739 housing units won't have an impact. I guess my sense, coming from a homeowners advocate side, and just hearing comments from other public statements, I just wrote a statement when I read that. Will this not impact nowhere near as eloquent as the chairman was, but will this not impact the lack of water resources available in Southern California based on the current projected supply, which we all hear about every day, not only in the state, but in the city. And the city's going to put all kinds of controls in place because we're not getting the water supplies we need. So maybe I'm making too much of this, but I see every negative deck that just automatically makes that statement, and I'm not sure that I agree with that. So maybe not a question, but I would not approve this based on what I understand. I would not accept the negative deck until I had more clarification.
Mr. Chair, if you'd like, I guess briefly respond and address the point. Essentially, when you're looking at a project, what it's approving, and that's what you're looking at in terms of measuring the impacts, because the housing element is essentially a policy document, and it is outlining that we have adequate sites and that we have these sorts of programs to produce affordable housing. It's not increasing the actual amount of housing stock that will occur in the city, and as a result, there's no impact, and that's really the reason why. And if you look at a neg deck for like 1 or 2 units, you might see the same thing. As we start to get into larger projects, you start to see there's a little bit more analysis done with respect to water and the impacts that a project may have. When we did the downtown specific plan, for example, that's the largest project I can look at. We had to do what's called a water supply assessment for that EIR, which looked at how we were going. The plan looked at approximately 3,900 units, and we looked at what the impact of that development would be on our water supply. So you really have to look at the scope of what's being approved to determine whether or not there's going to be an impact by that type of project. And since basically all the zoning that's identified in the housing element already exists. There's no real new development that's going to occur as a result of this housing element. Hope that.
Well, I guess my simplistic way of looking at it is this document is talking about a project that's going to occur in the future, which is kind of what you're saying. So just the statement that this has sufficient water supplies available to serve the project from existing entitlements and resources, or are new or expanded entitlements needed. If I think that in simple terms, as far as today, we don't have enough water to meet our needs today. So if I expand that from one unit to this many units over a period of time, I have some question as to whether we're going to be able to meet those needs as we build these projects. So, I'm not disputing what you say. It's just I had a different take on it.
Mr. Organi.
If I may say it slightly differently, in this case, the project is the policy document and not a specific development project. And in this and with this policy document, we're not increasing possible density or the possibility of additional units any further than what we have already analyzed in the past. However, that is not to say that as specific projects come that are going to be built, I'm saying basically what Mr. Garcia said from the angle I understand it, and that is that in those specific projects, when you know something is actually going to be built, then you will do a different level of water analysis. At this point, we're just basically saying the policies that we have in place work to meet the goals of the housing element. We're not saying anything more. And as such, there is sufficient water, as far as we know, to continue running the city as it's been run so far.
I understand the explanation, and that reiteration makes it clearer to me, but I guess the gut feeling I have is, the first question would be, then why do I need a negative deck today? Because I haven't built these houses. But let me finish, though. But I will, and I see what you're saying as far as the status quo is we're okay and we will be okay. But I'm trying to find a way to say that if we build multiple units, there will be multiple impacts, and what would that look like? I guess I'm trying to stretch this to answer questions or to make my mind clear on what the overall impact would be, and that's not what the document is about. But that's where I'm going. I'm looking at the overall impact, and how do I find a way to group all of that and say that if we're having trouble today, what is going to be the impact over time as we go forward, rather than if I look at one unit or one project, that would be a small impact. But if I know that there would be a series of multiple units, maybe 20 or 30 of them over the next 8 years, what would be that impact? So I guess I'm trying to build into this the total impact of all these units, and that's not what it's meant to do.
Maybe a different twist to what Mr. Agani said is not only are we not approving new development by this policy document, but CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, allows the city essentially when they're looking at a plan level type document to sort of look at more specific impacts as those projects actually come on board. So the second answer to your question probably is as we get projects that trigger a more intense level of environmental review, you'll be looking at it in those circumstances.
Just make one observation, and I'm done with it. What that sounds like to me is when I build a unit in the future, I'll look at it, and that one unit won't have enough impact to change the negative deck. So that's where we are. It's just kind of the status quo in my mind. So that's just an observation.
Mr. Torgerson.
I struggled with that same concept in the downtown-specific plan. And would a counterexample to this be, let's say our housing element said we decided we didn't have the real estate for the required number of houses in the existing zones, and so we were going to, our housing plan was we were going to grade off the top of part of the Verdugo Hills and put 1,000-house development up there. If you did that and said, that's my plan, then your negative declaration would have to say, holy cow, there's a significant impact to the environment, there'd be a significant impact to whole number of things, fire and water and what have you. Whereas this particular plan is pretty much saying with the existing zoning and the existing supply of lots, we can answer the mail. And so therefore, this plan isn't changing anything, so we don't need to have a negative declaration that's.
Actually, I think I'd agree with the way you're looking at it in that way, because some cities that have adopted housing elements where they've had to go and increase their production by upzoning have been told by the courts they have to do an EIR for that type of housing element, but whereas we already have the zoning in place.
In the downtown specific plan, where I was coming from, is they were talking about inadequate sewer capacity if we put in all these things that we plan to put in. And yet there was a kind of a negative, insignificant.
It's a statement of overriding considerations, right.
And, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to pay for it? And the answer was, well, they're just going to assess how much each development is going to, how much of a strain each development's going to put on the sewer system and add a little tax to it to help them pay as they go.
Share
it. It's a little off topic, but the reason we had to do it that way was because we didn't have the study in place at the time we adopted the DSP. Actually, since then, we do have the study, and so there is a process for doing that in that instance.
Okay.
Well, as we're all getting more familiar with CEQA, the purpose of CEQA is California Environmental Quality Act, and the purpose of this kind of environmental analysis is simply to analyze and disclose any kind of impacts, and it's not necessarily and to disclose if you cannot mitigate them. And to that extent, we did that. In the downtown specific plan, the distinction was that although the downtown specific plan was imposing restrictions that didn't exist before, the plan itself was meant to spur development that was not taking place. Therefore, we had to say that with the plan in place, although it's imposing more restrictions, we are going to see perhaps more development than we have thus far. So we were really going to analyze that. And in this case, we're not really spurring any new development other than what our current
I know it
zoning is.
states in there that each one will be looked at on an individual basis, so that makes it, the discussion's made it clearer for me.
I did discover a speaker card. Surprisingly, I don't know where it was.
Public input over?
He had his chance.
And I don't know if he's in favor, opposition, or an interested party, but we do have a speaker card from Bob Yusefian.
Who is an interesting
Thank you,
party.
Mr. Chair. I was actually cooking and listening to the show.
And something we said alarmed you.
Something was hot.
Some of you asked questions, and the staff unfortunately wasn't around at the time that we discussed some of those issues. They actually weren't in the city of Glendale. They weren't hired in here. So I thought I'd come by in here and bring you some perspective to some of the questions that was asked. One of the issues was a second dwelling unit in the back. The council decided not to go there, and the state passed a mandate that you have to have second dwelling units. We went to the state with the findings showing that we have more than 64% of our units that are rental in the city of Glendale, much larger than some other cities. Consequently, we did not have to meet those requirements. Also, we happen to be a charter city, so that was another requirement that we met, so that didn't happen. There was a question from the gentleman asking, how well are we doing in the affordable housing issue? I just happen to have one that I had asked, actually, from as a chair of housing. I had the opportunity to ask the staff to prepare this. I'll hand this to you so you can give it out. That's basically, I brought 5 copies, and it is color-coded by decades, and it shows you how many units were built per decade. I will be honestly to be telling you this. I know some of our neighboring cities may not be happy about that, but if you see, there's over 1,000 units that was built since 1970s. In the last 2000 till now, 400 and some odd units were built. I will venture to say that if you put all those numbers together, we built more affordable units than Burbank, Pasadena, and La Cañada combined. So when I think Mr. Guerrero asked, well, how do you know, how do you measure? And believe me, Mr. Milano asks us that every week. And so I kind of went through this.
I thought he was being channeled.
Right, so I I went to staff and I said, how do we really measure? How well are we doing and how much we're doing? Actually, you will see there's a question mark on the 71 units. That has already, we're waiting for the state to give the tax credits, but we have approved the project. We also have bought another piece of land which would allow us to build more, but I'm not in purview to tell you what that is because we're still negotiating. But I would tell you this council and the previous councils have worked very diligently to provide the affordable housings that we need. And we consciously made a decision that we want single-family residential to remain single-family residential because, believe it or not, it's very rare in the city of Glendale. So that's why we decided not to allow second dwelling units, but we actually at one point, code didn't allow granny flats. They allowed it, then they banned it, and then we came back and allowed the granny flats. But we did not want it to become R2 or R3 or whatever. So that's one of the reasons. So that's the history, gentlemen. So I thought I'll let you know. Also, to share some things that another commissioner asked about the RENA numbers. I spent about 3.5 years at SCAG, believe it or not. And I will tell you, I have my shares of that. Yeah, I know. But nevertheless, RENA numbers are basically given out by the state of California saying this is based on the projections that the population is going to grow. Unfortunately, the state of California's projection has been less than accurate lately, actually. And it looks like the SCAG's number of population was more accurate than the state's was. And so the population is going to be less than what the state anticipated, number one. Number two, what the state does is goes to region and says, every region like San Diego, this is your share. And then you have to divide it among your county. In LA County, Orange County, San Bernardino, Ventura County, and Riverside County, those are all part of SCAG. So what the state does, gives those allocations to SCAG, and the SCAG divides it among their cities. I will tell you, for the 3.5 years I was there, that's more of a political thing than that has to do with numbers. So some cities fight for the jobs and the housing, and some cities want the jobs and not the housing, and they pass the housing to somebody else, and some cities just don't want to build the housing, and they just pass it to somebody else. So the bottom line was, if you're not there and you don't oppose or you do not say that I don't have the land use to actually build this number of units, guess what? You end up with the 6,600 housing units, which we did last time, except the next run around when he came in on the RTP, I was there and I said, wait a second, your maps are wrong and we need to correct that. And so we corrected it. Believe it or not, Galleria in their maps showed to be residential. That tells you how accurate their maps are. So we corrected that, and I think our numbers now are a little bit more accurate than what it is, and it's guidelines. And where we lack mostly is in affordable, like most cities do. But we have tried to take the lead in providing the affordable housing, and the Housing Authority is doing a very good job. And I think our staff already talked about that. I can't say any more than the team that we have, considering there are very few people, they're working their fingers to the bone trying to provide all these housings. So I thought I'll give you some information that you needed. So if you have any questions about the past, ask the other old man who's still left. Ginger's in heaven, so I can tell you what's going on. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much. And thanks for interrupting your dinner.
I'll go back to cooking.
All right. Isn't it fair that we have a city councilman watching us during dinner when we watch them during dinner? All right. Okay. I think I would like to see us hurt our way toward making a recommendation toward council. I'm not sure if anybody would like to take the lead or embellish the statement that we were given, but I'll ask that somebody do so.
I'm despite my comments, I'm strongly in support of the housing element. I do think there are additional opportunities that we might want to consider, and I would recommend that we approve the housing element and the negative declaration with the addendum that the planning department add into its future work plan reassessment of the second unit's question and inclusionary zoning questions for their appropriateness for inclusion or consideration at a future time.
Before I ask for a second clarification, do we approve the negative deck or just acknowledge it?
No, just make a recommendation on that as well.
Well, actually, I prepared a resolution for this, which actually
Trying to find it.
includes, oh, you know what,
It's not in here.
it might have been stapled
on
onto
the
the
back of these
PowerPoint. Is it-
That's where
I'm
it was.
sorry.
I knew I'd seen it today.
You can never
You
find it.
hit it well.
Didn't mean to do that, sorry. But I included in there, Section 3, it says, based on the foregoing, the Planning Commission resolves the following, recommend to the City Council approval of the negative declaration and housing element. If you wanted to add into this about a work program for planning staff to look at the second units and inclusionary housing, we could do that too. We could amend it to add that.
That would be my amendment.
We have a motion seeking support. I'm guessing that it's the amendment that's stopping anyone from giving support.
Yes.
The motion is dying for lack of support. Could we have another motion, please?
I support, let me just, since I was the first one to say yes, it was dying because of the amendment. I think the amendment's a good idea. I think the staff should do that. I just don't know that it needs to be in a resolution coupled to the approval of the housing element.
And I would echo that. I think it's worthy of looking at. I'd hate to put it in the resolution.
All right, well, if I can amend my motion, then I would move adoption of the resolution as written and separately move that it's the interest of the body that the planning department include in its 09-10 goals, its work program for 09-10 assessment of both second units and inclusionary zoning for consideration, for assessment and consideration of the feasibility of and necessity of adopting policies to move those elements, second units and inclusionary zoning, forward in the future.
And I would second both of those resolutions if you can second two in a row, or two at once.
I'm going to let it go since we're kind of advisory anyway. Thank you, Mr. Garcia. We have a motion and support. Could you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Schmitz.
Aye.
Commissioner Torgerson.
Aye.
Commissioner Jarreau.
Aye.
Commissioner Lee.
Aye.
And Chair King.
Aye, on a vote of 5-0, the Planning Commission has recommended approval of the updating housing element to the City Council.
And
And further
Second.
instructions.
And
Further instruction
along
on the
with
plan.
along with additional instructions outside of the resolution. Planning Department updates.
Yes, at the last meeting, there was a request for goals of the city, of the planning department. We provided goals that were included as part of the budget package that went to city council.
Oh, and here I thought you did that, all of that just for us.
for us.
But I would like to thank Ida. Ida did put together a great exhibit for you for report of variances CUPs for the month of July.
Very
Yes,
much.
thank you, Ida. Those-
Thank you. And she also found the goals, too, so thank you.
It's a little disconcerting that you had to find them, but
They were in the recycling pile. Mr. Hagani.
One more thing. At the end of last year, the City Council, as you know, temporarily gave the responsibilities of the Board of Zoning Adjustments Appeals to the Planning Commission for a one-year period. I just would like you to know that as we approach the end of the year, I know we're just halfway, but the work plan is that we will be taking a report to the City Council to assess how it has worked, and if you'd like, we will bring that to your attention before we take it to the City Council in December or late November.
I think that would be appropriate. Very good. Any other planning department comments? Commissioner comments?
Welcome to Mr. Lee once again. He had a fun one to sit through for his first time.
I would just observe, I think that having us take on the zoning appeal process has been far less than I thought it was going to be. During my tenure, there was a lot more activity. That's actually one of the reasons I wanted to get a report on what was getting approved, because for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why there wasn't more people upset about things, either because it was granted or because it was denied. And I thought I had one other quick question. That I wrote on the agenda. Did the historical district get to City Council?
The Royal Boulevard Historic
Yes.
District. It's September 16th.
Thank you. I didn't recall the date. And you folks will be ready to talk about the cons as well as the pros in terms of potential opposition and so on.
We'll give a complete analysis.
Terrific. Anything else? Anyone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll take that by acclamation. We're adjourned.
Okay.